Why hardworking men stay financially stuck. The ceiling you can feel but can't explain. You work hard. You always have. That's not the issue. The issue is that working hard has never been the problem. And yet, at the end of another year, at the end of another cycle of genuine effort and real sacrifice, you find yourself in roughly the same place. Not identical. Things have moved, but not as far as they should have given everything you put in. There is a ceiling somewhere above your current position that you keep approaching and never quite passing. You can feel it. You can't explain it. And every conventional answer, work harder, save more, find a better opportunity, learn a new skill, has failed to move it. The reason most men stay financially stuck has nothing to do with their strategy, nothing to do with their work ethic, their intelligence, or the absence of opportunity. It has to do with something operating several layers beneath all of that. A set of psychological patterns so deeply installed, so thoroughly invisible, that they shape every financial decision a man makes without ever announcing themselves as the thing doing the shaping. Morgan Housel opened The Psychology of Money with an observation that most financial thinking refuses to make, that financial outcomes are determined less by what people know than by how they behave. And how they behave is determined not by logic or strategy, but by the specific emotional history they carry into every decision about money, the beliefs absorbed in childhood, the identity inherited from family, the stories told about who gets to prosper and who doesn't, and why. Seneca arrived at the same place from a different direction 2,000 years earlier. He wrote that a man's relationship with wealth reveals, with more precision than almost anything else, his relationship with himself. Not how much he accumulates, but what he does when accumulation becomes possible. Whether he builds or destroys, whether he holds or spends before it becomes real. Whether he advances or finds at the critical moment a reason to retreat. This video is about 7 patterns. Not 7 tips, not 7 strategies, not 7 things to add to your financial routine. 7 psychological patterns that operate invisibly inside the lives of hard-working, serious, intelligent men, and that keep producing the same result regardless of how much the external circumstances change. You cannot fix what you cannot see, and most men have never been given the framework to see these specific things clearly. That changes now. Pattern 1. You have an inherited money identity. Nobody starts their relationship with money from zero. This is the first thing Morgan Housel establishes, and it's the foundation everything else rests on. By the time you made your first financial decision as an adult, you had already spent years absorbing a complete and fully operational framework for what money means, who has it, who deserves it, what it does to people, and what your relationship with it was supposed to look like. You didn't choose this framework, you inherited it from the specific economic reality of the household you grew up in. From what was said about money at the dinner table, and what was never said because some things were too loaded to say out loud. If money was scarce in your family, you absorbed a specific set of beliefs about scarcity, about what financial struggle meant, about a person's worth, about whether wanting more was acceptable or ungrateful, about whether prosperity was something that happened to people like you or to people fundamentally different from you. If money was present but handled with anxiety, you absorbed that anxiety as the natural emotional accompaniment to financial responsibility. If wealth was associated in the people around you with coldness or absence or moral compromise, you absorbed a warning, a reason to keep a certain distance from the thing you were also supposed to pursue. None of this arrived as explicit instruction. It arrived as atmosphere, as the emotional temperature of 100 ordinary moments that collectively taught you what money was really about, beneath the surface of anything anyone actually said. Seneca wrote that most men are not governed by reason in their relationship with wealth. They are governed by habit. By the accumulated emotional weight of what they observed before, they had the capacity to examine what they were observing. The man who spends impulsively, the man who hoards anxiously, the man who earns well and still feels perpetually insufficient. These are not character flaws. They are inherited orientations, running automatically, producing the same patterns across decades because no one ever named them clearly enough to examine. Your money identity is not your financial personality. It is not fixed. But it is operational, right now in every financial decision you make. And it will remain operational until you develop enough awareness of it to see where it ends and where your actual judgment begins. Pattern 2. You've set an invisible wealth ceiling. There is a level of financial comfort that feels like home. Not your ideal level. Not the level you say you want when someone asks. The level that feels below the surface of any conscious reasoning, like the appropriate amount for someone like you to have. A number or a range that your system treats as the natural equilibrium point. When you fall below it, you work harder to get back. When you rise above it, something intervenes to bring you back down. This is what psychologists sometimes call a financial thermostat, and it operates with the same automatic precision as a thermostat on a wall. The temperature rises above the set point. The system cools it. The temperature drops below, the system heats it. The mechanism is invisible, but the result is consistent. A man with an unconscious wealth ceiling will find himself returning to roughly the same financial position again and again, regardless of the specific circumstances that moved him away from it. The ceiling is not set by the market. It is not set by your income or your opportunities or the economic conditions around you. It is set by your identity, by the internal image you carry of what a man in your position, with your background, with your particular story, is allowed to have. And when your actual financial reality begins to exceed that image, the system experiences a kind of cognitive dissonance. The surplus doesn't feel like success. It feels like exposure, like territory that doesn't belong to you. And the mind, highly efficient at resolving dissonance, finds ways to correct it. Morgan Housel observed that the most common financial self-sabotage isn't dramatic. It isn't reckless gambling or catastrophic decisions. It's the quiet, almost rational-seeming series of small choices that consistently prevent accumulation from reaching a certain point. The investment that seemed sensible but wasn't. The expense that felt justified but didn't need to happen then. The opportunity declined for reasons that seemed prudent at the time and hollow in retrospect. Seneca wrote that there are men who fear poverty and men who fear wealth, and that both are enslaved by the same thing, a relationship with money that was never examined. The man with an invisible ceiling is not afraid of failure. He is at some level, he has never fully articulated, afraid of what arriving would require him to become. And until that ceiling is identified and consciously raised, no strategy, no discipline, no external opportunity will move the result past the point his identity has decided is the limit. Pattern 3. You believe prosperity costs something essential. Somewhere along the way you learned a story about what money does to people. Maybe it was specific, a person in your life who had money and was cold or absent, or different in ways that felt like a warning. Maybe it was more diffuse, a general cultural atmosphere that treated wealth with suspicion, that associated prosperity with selfishness, that implied in 100 small ways that the pursuit of money and the preservation of what actually mattered were in fundamental tension with each other. Whatever the specific source, the conclusion was the same: getting there costs something essential. And part of you decided, without ever putting it into words, that the cost wasn't worth it. This belief doesn't announce itself when you're making financial decisions. It doesn't appear as a conscious thought that says, I'm going to limit my prosperity because I'm afraid of what it will do to me. It appears as hesitation at the critical moment, as a sudden loss of conviction when an opportunity becomes real, as a pattern of advancing to a certain point, and then reliably finding a reason that the timing isn't right, the risk is too high, The conditions aren't quite what they need to be. Morgan Housel writes that the most powerful stories we tell about money are the ones we tell ourselves. The narratives that explain why we behave the way we do, that make our patterns feel like rational responses to real conditions rather than emotional programs running on old data. The story that prosperity costs something essential is one of the most common of these narratives. And it is particularly powerful because it contains just enough truth to feel like wisdom rather than fear. Money does change things. Prosperity does alter relationships, priorities, and the texture of daily life. These are real observations. The problem is when a real observation becomes a universal law. When the specific story of one person you observed becomes the inevitable story of anyone who builds wealth, including you. When legitimate caution becomes a belief system that prevents you from ever testing whether your version of the story would actually unfold the same way. Seneca was precise about this. He wrote that the wise man is not made worse by wealth, he is revealed by it. What prosperity does to a person depends entirely on what that person brought to it. The fear that money will corrupt you is, in most cases, a fear that has more to do with an inherited story than with anything you have actually tested about yourself. The belief is not the truth, but it will keep producing the truth's consequences until you examine it directly. Pattern 4. You confuse movement with progress. There is a particular kind of man who is never not working. He is always in motion, always pursuing something, a new strategy, a new opportunity, a new approach to the same problem that didn't quite work the last time. His calendar is full, his effort is genuine, and his financial position, year after year, moves in ways that feel significant in the moment and look surprisingly similar in retrospect. Because movement and progress are not the same thing. And a man who confuses the two can spend decades generating enormous amounts of energy without ever building anything that compounds. This pattern is seductive precisely because it feels like its opposite. The man living it doesn't feel stuck. He feels busy, which the script he was given taught him to treat as evidence of seriousness, of responsibility, of a life being properly lived. Stillness feels like falling behind. Consistency in a single direction feels like limitation. So he moves, he pivots. He tries the next thing before the current thing has had time to produce a result. Because producing a result requires a patience that feels, from the inside, uncomfortably close to passivity. Seneca wrote about this with an exactness that reads less like ancient philosophy and more like a precise description of modern financial behavior. In his letters, he described men who travel constantly, moving from city to city, from project to project, from one set of circumstances to the next, and who are surprised to find that they feel the same in each new place as they felt in the last one. Because they brought themselves. The problem was never the location. It was never the strategy or the opportunity or the timing. It was the man making the decisions and the particular pattern of avoidance that movement had become. Morgan Housel makes a related observation, that the most powerful financial behavior is also the least exciting. Consistency, patience, the willingness to stay in one direction long enough for compounding, to do what compounding requires time to do. But compounding is invisible in the short term, and a man running on the belief that visible effort equals real progress will almost always abandon the position before the result appears. Progress requires commitment to a direction, and commitment to a direction requires tolerating the discomfort of not knowing whether it's working, for longer than most men are willing to wait. Pattern 5. You self-sabotage right before the breakthrough. This one is the hardest to see while it's happening, not because it's subtle in retrospect. Looking back, the pattern is usually obvious. The same sequence recurring across years. An opportunity becomes real, the result starts to appear. The breakthrough is close enough to feel, and something intervenes. A decision that seemed reasonable at the time. A conflict that appeared from nowhere at the worst possible moment. A sudden loss of conviction in a direction that was working. A reason, always slightly different in its specifics, always arriving at precisely the same point in the sequence. The self-sabotage doesn't feel like self-sabotage when it's happening. That's what makes it so effective. It feels like prudence, like realism, like the mature recognition that this particular opportunity wasn't quite right, that the timing could be better, that there's a legitimate reason to wait. The reasoning is always plausible. The pattern only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see how many times plausible reasoning has appeared at exactly the moment when advancing would have required you to become something you weren't entirely sure you were allowed to be. Morgan Housel writes that financial behavior under pressure reveals things about a person that behavior in ordinary circumstances never will. The man who manages money well when nothing is at stake and consistently makes poor decisions when the stakes become real is not making technical errors. He is responding to an emotional system that treats high stakes as threat rather than opportunity, that learned somewhere that the moment before arrival is also the moment of maximum exposure, and that exposure, historically, has been dangerous. Seneca understood the deeper mechanism. He wrote that the obstacle is never really the thing in front of you. It is the part of you that decided, before you were conscious of deciding, that the obstacle was larger than your capacity to move through it. The self-sabotage is not a failure of will. It is a loyalty to a version of yourself that was built before you knew what you were actually capable of. Seeing the pattern is not enough to stop it immediately, but naming it, recognizing it as a pattern rather than a series of unrelated reasonable decisions, is the first thing that makes interrupting it possible. Pattern 6. You spend what you build before it becomes real. Accumulation creates pressure. This is not obvious until you've experienced it, but for a man with an invisible ceiling, with an inherited money identity that places a limit on what feels appropriate, the act of watching money accumulate past a certain point generates a specific and uncomfortable internal tension. The account grows. The position strengthens, and instead of satisfaction, what arrives is something closer to anxiety. A restlessness, an urge to move the money, to spend it, to give it away, to invest it in something that immediately makes it less present, less real, less threatening in its implications. The spending that follows is rarely reckless from the outside. It often looks responsible: home improvements, gifts for people you love, an investment in something that seemed worthwhile. It looks in many cases like exactly what a serious man is supposed to do with money, which is part of what makes the pattern so difficult to identify, because the specific purchase rarely matters. What matters is the timing, the way the urge to spend consistently appears precisely when accumulation has reached a level that exceeds the internal image of what's appropriate. Morgan Housel observes that one of the least discussed financial behaviors is the discomfort of having enough. The way men who spend years pursuing financial security often find, when security arrives, that they don't quite know how to inhabit it, that they feel more at ease in the familiar tension of wanting and working toward than in the unfamiliar stillness of having and holding. And so they recreate the tension, not consciously but reliably. Seneca wrote that the man who cannot keep what he has built is not defeated by poverty. He is defeated by his own relationship with abundance. The capacity to build and the capacity to hold are different skills. Building requires drive, effort, the willingness to push. Holding requires something less familiar to most driven men: the ability to sit with what you've created without immediately converting it back into motion. Wealth is not built in the earning. It is built in the keeping. And the keeping requires a relationship with accumulation that most men were never taught to develop. Pattern 7. You don't believe you deserve to arrive. This is the one underneath all the others. Every pattern in this video has a version of this belief running beneath it. The inherited identity that places a ceiling on what feels appropriate. The conviction that prosperity costs something essential. The movement that avoids commitment, the sabotage that appears right before the breakthrough, the spending that converts accumulation back into tension, all of them at their root share a common foundation, a belief never fully articulated, rarely consciously held, but operationally present in every significant financial decision, that arrival is not for you. Not because you're inferior, not because you lack capacity or deserve failure, but because the definition of who gets to prosper, absorbed before you had the language to question it, didn't include someone with your specific story, your specific background, your specific combination of what you came from and what you've been through. And that definition, however old, however inherited, however entirely unexamined, has been functioning as the final authority on what your financial life is allowed to become. Seneca wrote that there are men who punish themselves with poverty as though it were a virtue, who treat financial struggle as evidence of moral seriousness and prosperity as something that belongs to people less principled than themselves. He was not describing asceticism as a conscious philosophy. He was describing self-denial as an unconscious pattern. The man who believes at some level he cannot fully articulate that wanting to arrive makes him less than the man who is content with less. Morgan Housel makes the observation that the biggest financial decisions most people will ever make have almost nothing to do with money. They have to do with identity, with the story a person tells about what kind of life is available to them, and what kind of life would require becoming someone they're not sure they recognize. The permission to build wealth, to hold it, to inhabit a level of financial security that exceeds what the script said was appropriate. That permission doesn't come from a strategy. It doesn't come from a new investment approach or a better savings plan. It comes from a decision, a specific, conscious, unglamorous decision about who you believe you actually are, and what you are actually allowed to build with the time and capacity you have left. You have been working hard enough. You have always worked hard enough. What has been missing is not effort, it is permission, the kind that no one can give you from the outside, because it was never theirs to give. Size to our Kaiga, and if you made it this far, if something in this video landed in a place that usually stays quiet in the middle of everything that needs your attention, if this perspective brought some clarity to your silence, consider subscribing to the channel to join our community, and leave your comment below. I read them. Every single one, because more often than not, the next topic comes from there, from the experiences you share, from the kind of pain that almost no one manages to put into words. And in the end, maybe the most important thing about this channel is simply the recognition that you are not the only one carrying this kind of silence. Thank you for your presence, for your attention, and for the time you chose to spend here today. See you in the next one.